The lesson this afternoon is entitled, Accept Good and Adversity. A common criticism tossed about by those that despise God is something akin to the statement, if he's so righteous, why does he let all the suffering in this world continue? It is my opinion that those who pose this question have a very narrow view of their lives and likely haven't considered the miraculous totality of the situation that we find ourselves in. The Bible answers this criticism. The answer's been there for centuries, millennia now even. And it answered it most succinctly in the book of Job. As those here well know, Job is probably the subject of the most suffering in the entirety of the Bible, save Jesus himself. And he loses nearly everything. One moment he was the wealthiest of men of his time, a patriarch of his day, possessing a great amount of land and livestock, having a good wife and family. More than that, he had good testimony from God, saying he was an upright man that shuns evil. There was no other servant of his like him. So then Satan took an interest whenever God said these things of Job and said, if you take away all these things and the hedge that you've put up around him, he will no longer be your servant. He will surely curse you to your face. And so God gave Satan free rein to do everything to him, barring actually killing Job. And he takes away all of his wealth, all of his herds, his children. And his wife is left, but even she turns against him. And in chapter 2 and verse 9 of that book, she says to him, do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. And then he responds to her, you speak as one of the foolish women. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity? The rest of this book goes through a deliberation along that theme. Job is rightfully upset, and understandably so, at the loss that he suffered, and yet he says that he will continue to honor God despite this great calamity, because he understands that all that he had and all the wonderful things that he enjoyed in his life were from God, and that just as he could give them, so also could he take them away, and he is well within his right to do so. Job is possibly the most humble man described in the Old Testament. Surely it would be a horrible challenge to face what he did and still be faithful. And yet he managed it. Instead of ranting and raving about how God should never allow him to suffer even an ounce of what he did, he instead acknowledges that the Lord gave him all these things and that he didn't owe him any of them to begin with. We read in chapter 9, verses 1 through 4, and Job answering one of his friends, truly I know it is so, but how can a man be righteous before God? If one wished to contend with him, he could not answer him one time out of 1,000. God is wise in heart and mighty in strength. Who has hardened himself against him and prospered? He removes the mountains, and they do not know when he overturns them in his anger. He shakes the earth out of its place, and its pillars tremble. He commands the sun, and it does not rise. He seals off the stars. He alone spreads out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. He made the Bear, Orion, and the Pleiades, and the chambers of the south. He does great things past finding out, yes, wonders without number. If he goes by me, I do not see him. If he moves past, I do not perceive him. If he takes away, who can hinder him? Who can say to him, what are you doing? God will not withdraw his anger. The allies of the proud lie prostrate beneath him. So we see Job has a very good understanding of his place in God's creation. He understands that he would not have his life were it not for God to begin with. He would not be able to be a servant to God. He would not have the life that he did, save for our Creator. And how can Job, as he implies in his message here, ever hope to have contention with God? How could he ever hope to debate him on what's right and what's wrong? How could he say to God, how dare you take away all these wonderful things I had? Instead, he says, God is wise in heart and mighty in strength, who has hardened himself against him and prospered. And no man can be righteous before God. It is not for any man to say, I'm righteous enough to say whether or not God is right or wrong. There are many today who look at some of the events of the Old Testament and say, look at all the killing that happened. Surely God is not a good God. He is evil and he's a bully. Very shallow and irreverent interpretation. And one that is taken severely out of context. The Israelites were commanded, as the chosen people of God, to take the land of Canaan. And they did so. And God said it was in order that they might receive their promised land, but also that the nations would be punished for their wrongdoing and their severe deviation from God's will. Job understands that the suffering that he may endure in this life means nothing when he considers the righteousness of God and how serving him is the best thing that he could possibly do in his life, and that honoring him will only result in reward, even if not now, but later. And these days, in this time that we find ourselves in the age of Christ, we have even more perspective than he did. He, at the time, presumably received revelation directly from God, God giving him direct commandments as the patriarch of his family, telling him what to do. He knew that in order to cover the sins of his family and even the ones that he didn't know whether or not they commit, it says in chapter 1, he would sacrifice some of his animals just in case his children cursed God behind his back. And as we observed this morning, this isn't just a random act. Job would only do this if God had commanded it of him. And yet he did not know God's plan of salvation or his plan that had been in place from the foundation of the world. Today we have the benefit of understanding all the revelation that there will ever be. We live in a time where Christ has come and we now live under his rule. And we understand that this will be the final age and that this is our second chance. And that salvation is offered to us. But even though Job didn't know what was going on and didn't know that the Lord was testing him and that Satan was persecuting him, yet still he remained faithful and ascribed righteousness to God and maintained his respect and fear despite losing so much. Not knowing that God would restore all of this and that he would serve as an example to us in these later times. And those that question, why is there so much suffering in the world? Surely God must do something about it. Just as Job may not have understood at the time what was happening, well, not just as, but he perhaps didn't understand what was happening, but we do. We understand that suffering for Christ is commendable and that it is all but required in order for us to be approved of God. So not only should we emulate his patience, we should rejoice when our faith is tried. In James chapter 1, verse 2 through 4, he writes, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your patience produces, that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing." So not only do we know that our faith will be tried, we should rejoice when it is. That in the trying of our faith, we might become better servants to God. It's this suffering that will temper us and allow us to become followers of Christ. If our faith is never tested, and if we're not ever made to suffer, and not by the hand of God, but by the hands of other men, then what do we profit? If our faith is never tried, it's because we're not trying. If someone is able to go throughout their whole life and never face any adversity, then they are not living the life of a Christian. It is surely inevitable that in the service of God, we will come into conflict with those who despise him. And in verse 12 of James chapter 1, we read, "Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. And let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good and every perfect gift is from above, and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of his creatures." So we are the first fruits of his creatures. We are his chosen people now. And as it says there, we will be called righteous if we endure in the face of temptation, and if we endure suffering in the service of God. And just as Job understood that all his wealth and all his righteousness could only come from God, so too, as James writes, every good and perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights. All that we enjoy in this life that we have here, and especially for us living in this wonderful time that we do, where we do not have the burden of the law of Moses, but we live under the law of Christ. And we have this wonderful book that gives us all that we need to be servants and to reach heaven one day. we understand that this life we enjoy can only come from God, and that any suffering we might endure will only help us to be better servants to Him. And those that ask, why does God allow so much suffering in the world? Well, if there was no suffering, then why are we here? Why did He give us free will? If God were to, at every moment of every day, monitor everyone, and in the moment they might suffer or face any challenge to remove that obstacle from their way, then what would be the purpose of free will? And what would be the purpose of His calling to us? Surely if He miraculously intervened every single time we might face any adversity, then why do we have a choice in anything? Why would He give us a choice in anything? He has given us this New Testament and its requirements so that those who diligently seek Him shall be saved. And those who choose to follow after Him, knowing full well that it's going to be a path rife with adversity, and that the path unto salvation is straight. The gates that lead unto salvation are straight, and the way is narrow. Knowing that we're going to suffer ridicule at the hands of men, knowing that we're going to suffer the loss of friends, maybe family, knowing that so many will criticize us and call us fools. And yet, we are told that to suffer for Christ proves our faith, and it will be accounted to us for righteousness. In 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 20, Peter's writing in this context about servants being submissive to their masters, and yet the principle here still applies. For what credit is it if when you are beaten for your faults, you take it patiently? Anyone can do that and should do that. If we do wrong, we must suffer the consequences and do so with grace. But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, then this is commendable before God. Even if you were the most righteous Christian to have ever lived, you will still suffer. And if a Christian is truly righteous, they will understand that this suffering will only make their faith stronger. And it will warrant a reward from God, because He has said that if you do good and suffer, then you will be commended. In verse 21, for to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow His steps, who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in His mouth, who, when He was reviled, did not revile in return. When He suffered, He did not threaten, but He committed Himself to Him who judges righteously, who Himself bore our sins in His own body on the tree, that we, having died to sins, might live for righteousness, by whose stripes you were healed. If Christ, the only sinless man to have ever lived, the only begotten Son of God, came and died for us, lived His entire life remaining faithful to the Lord and being completely spotless, if He had to suffer the things that He did, who are we to say that God is cruel for letting us suffer? Those who ask that question I did at the start, how is God righteous if He allows suffering in the world, have surely not read a single thing out of the New Testament. And if they have, they haven't applied any sort of reasoning to it and attempted to understand it. Jesus came and suffered for us, and now we must suffer for him. And just as he died and was resurrected, so too we may also be buried in baptism and be resurrected in newness of life with him. And we must suffer for the rest of our days, and we will die just as he did, and then we will be resurrected in the final day into newness of life. We might be with him forever in heaven. We will suffer here, and then we will be rewarded if we remain faithful. If we continue to seek for Jesus and seek God diligently. The plan of salvation is again hearing and believing, repenting of one's sins, confessing Christ as the one true Son of God, and then being baptized so we may put him on and that we might have him as an advocate before the Lord. And living this life and facing the suffering that we do, many fall away, and understandably so, but yet we are called to repentance and to seek forgiveness in the face of those trials if we should fail. If there are those who need to, this afternoon,